Thank you for attending this webinar by CALS today. So in 2020, the American Journal of International Law published an editorial by Professor Richard Wilder, which called for international law's engagement with the possibility that humanity might make contact with intelligent and technologically advanced life elsewhere in the galaxy and the universe. So the search of such life has involved multiple and diverse individuals, scientific associations, academic institutions, governments, and international organizations. However, the issue has not been given sustained or rigorous attention by the international law community. So this online seminar brings together experts from the international law and scientific community to discuss recent developments in the search for intelligent life in space. How should international law regulate and respond to such life in space? What are some pressing far future legal aspects? What is the security element within potential response strategies of international law? And are current international law norms adaptable and adequate? The speakers will draw on their distinguished and multidisciplinary backgrounds to discuss these issues. They will each speak for 20 minutes, and that will leave us plenty of time for questions and answers. So I will now introduce our first speaker, Professor Michael Bohlander. He's a chair in global law and SETI policy at Durham Law School and the international co-investigating judge in the international extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. He has written a fascinating book, Contact with Extraterrestrial Intelligence and Human Law, published by Brill. And his current main focus is on the relationship between the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and human life in the wider sense. He'll be speaking about legal issues affecting this topic, especially far future ones. Professor Bohlander, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jia. Let me just share my screen. Right, can everybody see the screen? Good, so thanks very much for inviting me to talk about this. I'm going to give a bit of a background to why we're actually in the position that international law is looking at life in space, as you put it. So I know that Ms. Almanar will be talking about specifics, especially around the laws of war, humanitarian law. So I'll just touch upon these in my presentation, but I give the general background of why we got to be there and what the some of the non-legal framework parameters are. So first of all, I think we need a very brief look at what the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI, actually is all about. So basically, so far, it's been radio astronomers looking into space or listening into space and trying to find a signal, so far without any confirmed success. In the context of SETI, there are two famous expressions. Like the first one is the Drake equation. Frank Drake was an astronomer who was trying to find a formula, an equation by which he could calculate an estimate of how many intelligent civilizations might be out there in the galaxy or the universe. And it's Seth Shostak has said it's still, I mean, even though it's in mathematical form, it is in a sense closer to magic than mathematics. So I'm not going to go into any detail there because it don't really concern us. The other one is the so-called Fermi paradox, phrased by the Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, who basically says that if there is so much life out there in the universe, you have a huge universe, and the further out you are in the universe, the older you are, so the chances would be that there are civilizations which are much more advanced than we are and would have started colonizing at least their galaxies and possibly other galaxies a long time ago, maybe with automated robots. But we haven't found anybody, so where is everybody? So the argument there is because we haven't found them, they're not there. So this is the kind of general backdrop from SETI that we need to bear in mind. Now, the next problem we get is, even if we are assuming that there is a possibility of contact, which is where the international law bit really comes in, because unless we make contact with anybody, there's not much to regulate in relation to extraterrestrial intelligence. There are different types of contact that we might be facing. So the first one as I just mentioned, is a radio signal from afar, which is what is happening so far. People are listening with huge telescopes. And now with the James Webb in orbit, we have a much better position to maybe even get a signal if that telescope was actually ever used for that. But that is the contact which is seen as least problematic, because if we get a signal from somewhere in outer space, chances are it will be several light years away outside our solar system, which means that a two-way conversation is almost impossible in human lifetimes. Unless they come to visit us, there will be no direct contact. Unless, of course, that signal itself is something which makes a direct contact with our technology. So you could imagine, for example, that being an AI virus that is being sent by a malevolent extraterrestrial civilization, just as an example. So that would be almost a direct contact by a mere radio signal. Then the other one, which gets a bit closer to home, is what if you find an artifact? You know, in science fiction films, you always, somebody flies to the moon and then you find an old spaceship, or there's a huge hole in the moon, and inside you find that the moon is actually hollow and all that kind of stuff. So what if we found an artifact which was clearly not natural, so artificial, in our solar system? And one candidate for that, which has been sitting there on the shelf of unsolved anomalies, is this picture from NASA of asteroid 433 Eros, which was taken by the Near Shoemaker probe in 2000, which shows what NASA calls a 45-meter rectangular boulder. Now, knowing that God does not build in straight lines, that should make you sit up and listen. But there is so far no other picture available, and NASA has said that they do have no high-definition resolution pictures of that. So artifact makes it already a little bit more complicated. And of course, when we move to the proper science fiction scenario of having spacecraft, be they crewed by possibly biological entities or automated probes in our solar system in Earth orbit or on Earth, and things become much more complicated and immediate already. In this context, I just want to touch on a special problem, because as you all will have heard in recent months, or almost basically since 2020, that there is increased interest internationally, and especially in the US, with regards to so-called unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAPs. Previously, they were called UFOs. UFOs basically are now restricted to artificial objects that move in airspace or other media on Earth. And there is, of course, a widespread community of conspiracy theorists and less than rigorous researchers that deal with this area. So I just want to flag it up, because it has come under official investigation, at least in the States. And just a few days ago, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States Armed Forces released a memo which actually calls for the search for UAP and recording and monitoring UAP across the world in all the areas where American forces are stationed and with their allies. So they're taking this very seriously. ETH means the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is what we're looking at today, basically, that something is coming from outer space and visiting Earth. But there are people like the famous UAP researcher Jacques Vallée, who posit that it might actually be something from another dimension. So it's called the interdimensional hypothesis. This is even a larger leap of faith than assuming that something is coming from outer space. So it's just for completeness sake. Then we have, of course, the close encounter categories 3, which you find in that movie Close Encounter of the Third Kind, i.e. you meet either a spaceship or actual aliens. And Close Encounter 4 would be the abduction scenarios. We're not going to go into these, but all of that at some stage or another can have an impact on how international law should deal with any of this. So, as I said before, currently we're looking at signal detection by astronomers, but we need to move beyond that. The signal detection as such is not a classical space law or even international law topic. There is so far no legally binding regulation on what happens once a signal has been detected. Who gets to tell the world? You know, do the scientists do that themselves, or do they involve the United Nations? There are there's the SETI protocols of the International Academy of Astronautics, IAA, but they are not legally binding. So if the scientific community would actually abide by them is a different issue. But in order to make this really a live topic, we need to consider scenarios of direct contact. And as I said before, we cannot now exclude the UAP issue from our research paradigm. The IAA still refuses to encounter or to entertain research on UAP, no matter how rigorous in its terms of reference. That is apparently meant to change, but it has a role to play beyond the regulation of SETI as such. METI, i.e. the messaging of messaging to extraterrestrial intelligence, sending messages out to space. SETA is the search for extraterrestrial artifacts, or PD as post-detection. What we also found in the early years already, in 1950s, 1960s, was this idea of a cosmic meta law, which Haley and Fazan were writing about, which was a big issue at the time, which basically meant to find any kind of common ground between aliens and humanity. Fazan, for example, was proceeding from the basis of Kant's categorical imperative to basically argue that, you know, aliens probably would want to be treated in the same way as humans would want to be treated. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. If anybody wants to discuss this in the Q&A afterwards, I'm happy to do that. But my position on that, it is premature speculation, because we don't have anybody to talk to other than us at the moment. At least officially, we don't. So there's no point in theorizing cosmic meta law. What we need to do is find a human law baseline for contact with ETI. What would the human reaction be? What would be the legal criteria on which we would base our reaction? And that contact may be benevolent or it may be hostile. And if you look at the current discussion in SETI, you find that it is laboring under two particular myths. The first one is that ETI will have passed an evolutionary stage of self-destruction and therefore be benevolent towards other civilizations if they are capable of interstellar travel. So if they're so far advanced, they've gotten past the stage where they would have destroyed themselves in their chain of evolution. Now, if you look at human development so far, the scientific development that has happened here, even in the last 100 years, it has not meant an equivalent major ethical advance. You just need to look to Ukraine or to Gaza to see that that's not really something we can take for granted. So thinking that an extraterrestrial species coming towards us would be benevolent just because you can travel interstellar distances cannot be taken for granted, and I think it's wishful thinking. Even if they were benevolent, we need to think about who they might be benevolent towards. You know, it might be the humans, but they might also see us as a kind of an invasive species on this planet, and the actual people they want to talk to would be the dolphins. So just because they're benevolent might not mean they're benevolent to us. And you know, Stephen Hawking has realized it quite a long time ago when he said we only have to look at ourselves to see how intelligent life might develop into something we wouldn't want to meet. So advancement does not necessarily mean, technological advancement doesn't necessarily mean an equal advance in ethics and morals. Now, the second myth that you find very often is that if they come, they will be so far advanced technologically that resistance is futile. And of course, I'm calling this here from Star Trek, so forgive me for all these pictures from movies, but you know, it spices the whole thing a little up a little. But if that's the case, and if they come in this one, which is from District 9, you might not really think that they are so terribly technologically advanced that we couldn't put up a defense. which then, of course, feeds into the idea that if we can put up a defense, how would we defend ourselves? So Michael Michaud, one of the great theorists and researchers of SETI, has said that SETI conventional wisdom assumes that because we will be much less technologically advanced than any other civilization that we contact, we would be helpless if the extraterrestrials were hostile. This disparity may turn out to be true, but it remains unproven. To assume our weakness in advance would be preemptive capitulation, and I agree with that assessment. So what happens, that's another quote from Independence Day, the first one, what happens if they do become hostile? And that means we need to look at, we need to start thinking about strategy. So this is what we were crossing over into the lunatic fringe part of this presentation, because it assumes that we will actually seriously think about doing something to counter a hostile alien approach to Earth or whatever. But the thing is that it's not something which is so far out on the fringe that people haven't been thinking about it. And there is this particular book which helped me a lot in writing my book, and that's Deep Space Warfare by John Wright. He's a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. And he has written this primarily, of course, to talk about interhuman warfare from space. But he also includes, and he's the only one I've seen so far, he includes in every aspect of the book the possibility of a non-human opponent, which is fascinating. And he also goes in depth into the psychological issues that might create, lack of understanding, the Kidditus trap, and all this kind of thing. So people are thinking about it seriously, and I think we should be doing it ourselves. I've just started a working group with the International Institute of Space Law called SETI and Law, where we're doing just that. It's a 3-year working group to deal with legal issues, not just international law issues, but also risk and disaster management issues, things like that, that would arise. And that's the far future element here that would arise if there was ever direct contact with an alien species. You also need to take the long view. So this is something, you always get these comments, and we've got different problems on Earth. We've got climate problems. We've got war everywhere. We've got famine, poverty, everything. You really think we need to talk about ET? That's a fair point. My normal answer to that is that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that a number of already existing existential risks do not mean that we can't have a look, a precautionary consideration of another potentially existential risk. And let's be frank, if we ever actually really made a confirmed contact with an alien species, that would be probably the most existential situation that Earth would ever have faced. So I think we need to take a long view when we're looking at this. I'm just going to touch upon this briefly because Ms. Almanar will be talking about this in detail, but here, since my book is about the laws of armed conflict as well, how would we comport ourselves? If we have a humanitarian law to deal with interhuman warfare, would we abide by the human laws of warfare if we had a war on with aliens? So would xenocide, for example, be a first choice preemptive option to protect the human species from annihilation? So this picture here is taken from Ender's Game, a famous novel about the preemptive extermination of an alien species to avoid any further invasions from them. Would we give them the same kind of, if you want to call it that, courtesy in warfare, extend the same kind of protections as we do to each other, at least on paper? But I'll leave that to Ms. Almanar. She'll go into detail on that. The other thing that, of course, arises is that, if the contact is benevolent, and if they're actually benevolent towards us and not the dolphins, we might be faced with a scenario where we're being asked to join what has been termed a galactic club, i.e. an interstellar network of civilizations. And as with every club, there are normally some kind of admission criteria. And so what would we be willing to accept? We always have to assume that any ethics, morals, or whatever these interstellar networks or civilization might have very likely won't be the same as ours, or at least we cannot assume that. And if they have been developing for such a long time, then they may have moved on from moral persuasions that we still have, be it on religious or on political grounds or whatever, and be very pragmatic and practical about something. So what, for example, if there was a civilization that offered us technology that would basically solve all the climate problems, would solve all the energy and food and whatever problems, and we'd be basically back to paradise in 10 years after they met us. But they said, hang on, the reason or the condition that we have for you to get this kind of technology is that we want to have 1,000 human beings to experiment upon. Now that would pose a clear violation of almost any kind of human rights condition that or human rights treaty that has been negotiated across the world. So would we be willing to do that? Sacrifice 1,000 so the entire Earth can get back to a paradise state? Do the needs of the many really outweigh the needs of the one, to cite Mr. Spock? But that's something, again, which we can discuss in detail in the Q&A. So I'm not going to go into any more detail on this one. The message that I have in my book is that we need to move towards what I call a cosmic species consciousness. At the moment, we're just warring factions on one planet. We can't, as we see now at the moment in glaring clarity, we can't even agree in the one organization that we have, which is meant to pacify the world, which is the United Nations, which is a catastrophe at the moment, with two permanent Security Council members, Russia and China, flaunting the rules-based world order. So the chances that we actually get to the point of thinking of us as a planetary species that is just one of many in the cosmos are low, but I think we should actually get to this point if we are meant to be in a position to deal with an entirely alien species. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop it now.
Thank you very much, Professor Bolander. We will now move on to our next speaker, Ms. Rosa Almanar. Ms. Rosa Almanar has a LLB in law in a high-performance group by the University of Valencia and an LLM in international law at the University of Madrid. She is a research member of the newly established working group on SETI and law under the auspices of the International Institute of Space Law. Her research lines focus on the discipline of space law and policy, and she'll be speaking about the security element within potential response strategies. So over now to you, Rosa.
Thank you, Professor Chia. I will now proceed to share my screen. Please confirm that you can see my slides correctly. Okay, thank you. So as Professor Bolander has already introduced, since the early 20th century, the science fiction genre has brought at grand scenes, contributing to build a shared imaginary surrounding the figure of aliens, which has persisted to the present day. We are accustomed to watching full-length movies that depict these extraterrestrial species as some sort of creatures from distant planets who seek to forcefully invade the Earth. Movies like the ones you can see in the slide, Independence Day or War of the Worlds, are just a few examples of how a first contact or encounter with alien civilizations is often portrayed as hostile. But what if such circumstances were to occur? What if at some point in time, the Earth was indeed attacked by an extraterrestrial species? How could, in this case, international law react to such a use of force? Are there any rules that dictate how to act in such cases? Well, these are the questions that I will be addressing during this presentation. The first answer is negative. International law does not provide any guidance, as this is a scenario which has been scarcely discussed due to presumed infeasibility. But there are indeed certain international law regulations that we could try to adapt in order to face this hostile contact by extraterrestrial intelligence. To begin with, we shall depart from the premise that this extraterrestrial intelligent life is recognized or should be recognized as an international legal person. For it to be granted both rights and duties under international law, and to be able to legally act, for instance, entering into contracts or committing torts. Otherwise, everything that we will be addressing today will be pointless. In addition, two settings should be distinguished. On the one side, a potential hostile contact occurring in outer space itself, including on celestial bodies. For instance, a human settlement in the future is under attack, a human settlement on the moon or other celestial bodies. And on the other side, a hostile contact is taking place on the Earth's surface. That means here, where we are. In case of the former, international space law, which is the specialized legal regime under international law governing space-related activities, offers no indication at all in this regard. However, there is a concrete provision which regulates the militarization of outer space and, in this case, may serve us as a starting point of discussion. I am speaking of Article 4 of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, considered the Magna Carta of space law, which sets out the basic principles and norms of this legal regime. This clause limits the freedom of exploration and use of outer space, which is granted by Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, by setting forth certain boundaries to the possibility of undertaking military activities in outer space. Here in this slide, you have the first paragraph, which expressly forbids the placement of objects carrying two specific types of weapons. These are nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in orbit around the Earth, and it also prohibits the installations of such weapons on celestial bodies and the stationing of such weapons in outer space in any other manner. Nevertheless, the use of these weapons in outer space or its launching from Earth into space is not prohibited nor prevented from its literal wording. What is more, by making express reference to these two concrete types of weapons, it is clear that this prohibition doesn't cover conventional weapons, for instance, which can thus be lawfully placed in orbit around the Earth. If we look then at the second paragraph, by contrast, this deals with the use of the moon and other celestial bodies, but reserving them only to peaceful purposes. So, by omitting any kind of reference to outer space, in this case, it doesn't address the empty between the celestial bodies, for instance. Moreover, it is specified that no bases, installations, or fortifications can be established on the celestial bodies, and then the testing of all types of weapons and the conduct of military maneuvers on celestial bodies is forbidden. Therefore, as far as this Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty is concerned, states remain free to theoretically use conventional weapons in outer space, but when it comes to utilizing these weapons and conducting military activity in the surface of celestial bodies, let's come back to that example of a human settlement in a celestial body, on a celestial body who is under attack. In these cases, if we conduct military maneuvers on these celestial bodies in order to defend ourselves, prima facie, these actions could breach the international obligation enshrined by Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. If we resort to the McGill Manual on International Law applicable to military uses of outer space, also called MILAMOS, its Rule 146 establishes that in addition to the prohibition on weapons of mass destruction, remember the first paragraph of Article 4, space activities involving any other weapons shall be carried out in accordance with international law, including the Charter of the United Nations and international space law. This rule is actually consistent with Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty, according to which space activities shall be carried out in accordance with the generally recognized principles of international law, and in particular those included in the UN Charter, so as to maintain international peace and security and to promote international cooperation and understanding. In this line, there are three different international law areas which should be briefly examined in connection to the present topic. These are the use of force used at bellum, international humanitarian law used in bello, and international criminal law. Firstly, regarding the use of force in international law, it is Article 2.4 of the UN Charter which prohibits the threat or use of force, and therefore this article should be carefully considered. First, it should be remembered that states are the addressees of this precept, because when the UN Charter was drafted in 1945, it was approached from an interstate perspective. Since the drafters did not envisage that a non-state entity, for instance, an armed group of persons, or an extraterrestrial civilization in this case, could rise up against a state. Consequently, in order for the use of force to contravene these provisions of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, it must be carried out by a state against another state. This article is a peremptory norm of general international law, also known as ius cogens, which means that it is a rule accepted and recognized by the international community of states as a whole as a norm from which no derogation is permitted, and which can only be modified by a subsequent norm of general international law having the same character. That means another ius cogens rule. However, there are three overarching exceptions that could legally justify the non-compliance with this peremptory norm. And these are, first, self-defense, enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Then we have the UN Security Council authorization of the use of force. And lastly, the self-determination of peoples if the right to self-determination is being prevented by coercive actions committed by their corresponding colonial powers. For the present scenario, the one we are examining in this presentation, the concrete one that interests us is, of course, self-defense. In order to be invocable, self-defense requires the existence of a prior internationally wrongful act, which involves the use of force, for instance, an armed attack, in which case the state claiming self-defense as a ground for excluding wrongfulness could have responded to that attack with a provisional use of force subsidiary to the action of the Security Council. Of course, the state must report to the Security Council on the measures it adopts. It is interesting in this regard what the International Court of Justice says in its All Platforms case, where we can see how it demands the fulfillment of these conditions. In this respect, the notion of attack is described by Article 49, first paragraph of the Protocol First, additional to the Geneva Conventions of 1949 relating to the protection of victims of international armed conflict of 1977 as acts of violence against the adversary, whether in offense or in defense. As a result, according to the International Court of Justice, an armed attack which triggers the right of self-defense must attain a certain degree of seriousness. By the same token, the response in self-defense must comply with both the principles of proportionality and necessity. Even if the circumstances justify the adoption of military countermeasures, it is required for these countermeasures to meet the criteria of the necessity and the proportionality of the measures taken in self-defense. We can see that requirement portrayed in the case of Nicaragua by the International Court of Justice. Therefore, the result is that states involved in individual or collective self-defense must not only demonstrate that they suffered an actual armed attack, but also that the countermeasures they adopted were both necessary and proportionate to the attack endured. In this regard, the Milamos Manual, remember the McGill Manual, interestingly establishes in its Rule 152 relating to the right of self-defense that the physical and legal characteristics of outer space must be taken into account in any exercise of a state's right of self-defense, especially if we put this in relation with the proportionality and necessity tests, whose criteria should be suited to the inherent characteristics of the outer space environment. So, when considering the proportionality and necessity tests, in these cases, it is critical to ensure that the criteria used are appropriate for the unique features of the outer space environment. Furthermore, it should be clarified that preventive or anticipatory self-defense, which means use of force by one state to prevent another from engaging in a particular conduct that is not immediately threatening, so it doesn't comply with the requirement of threat of the use of force, neither with the use of force itself, but which, if allowed to persist, may lead to an act of force against the former at some point. So this preventive or anticipatory self-defense is forbidden by international. Thus, in the event of an extraterrestrial life civilization approaching us, an armed attack as preventive self-defense to play it safe just in case they attack us first will be unlawful, constituting a breach of the conventional obligation enshrined by Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, as it would not observe the legal requirements for such action to be considered a self-defense. Concerning international humanitarian law, this discipline restricts the methods used to conduct war, irrespective of whether the war is lawfully initiated, for instance, in self-defense against an armed attack, and thereby limits the permissible means of waging hostilities. In this respect, for the purposes of this presentation, it is especially relevant to address the so-called principle of humanity, outlined in Article 3 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. It is common to all the conventions, according to which persons taking no active part in the hostilities, including members of forces who have laid down their arms and those placed hors de combat by sickness, guns, detections, or any other cause, shall in all circumstances be treated humanely, without any adverse distinction founded on race, color, religion, or faith, sex, birth, or wealth, or any other similar criteria. So, in this regard, it should be considered whether the international humanitarian law principle in particular could be applicable to intelligent extraterrestrial life as one of the conditions to be included under the umbrella of other similar criteria, in the sense of, for instance, no distinction based on species. So it couldn't constitute a discrimination based on species to treat this extraterrestrial intelligence humanely, so to say. This can be examined through a twofold stand. On the one hand, humans, of course, would understandably be reluctant to provide protection of any kind to a species seeking to annihilate or subjugate humankind. But on the other hand, it is also true that denying them the humanity underlying these provisions as an equal standing to us could be categorized as a form of speciesism, seizing could privilege human well-being and rights over theirs, given that it is us, the humans, who create the norms. The arguable violation, of course, of these norms that we have been analyzing could ultimately result in the incurrence of international criminal liability, in which case the international criminal law regime could be applicable. This raises a question as to whether extraterrestrial intelligence or humanity itself could be prosecuted for the commission against each other of the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, which are the ones that endow the International Criminal Court with material jurisdiction to hear the case. And these, as you probably know, are the ones enshrined in Article 5 of the Rome Statute, the Statute of the International Criminal Court, and are composed of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crime of aggression. Furthermore, in the event that a state becomes a party to the statute after its entry into force, the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court shall extend only to crimes committed after the entry into force of the statute in general or in respect of that concrete state, unless it has made a declaration under Article 12, paragraph 3rd. So, except this, where this extraterrestrial intelligence expressly accepts the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, it doesn't seem that such crimes could be judged upon its competence as a first instance. By way of conclusion, it is evident that a reassessment of all these sets of rules appears as necessary. Firstly, with respect to the obligated parties, because we are not referring to the common concept of states as such, but rather to humanity as a whole and this extraterrestrial intelligence civilization as two opposing forces. So this could require a reevaluation of the addresses of these norms. Secondly, in the event of a hostile first contact, or after the failure of any attempt at a peaceful agreement between these two parties, the provisions of our international legal order could be incumbent upon us alone. This could lead us to think that in the absence of acceptance on their part of our terrestrial norms, the question of whether these norms should even be respected in such a scenario arises. Why would us have to comply with a set of rules which is only binding on our side if they are not applying any sort of humanity principle or any other kind of norm? Our current international law framework is not prepared to face a confrontational interaction with extraterrestrial intelligence. Basically, and mainly because we depart from an array of regulations specifically tailored to deal with disputes among states rather than any other kind of entities. However, it is true that many of these rules can serve as a starting point, as a starting ground for the development of norms that better accommodate these evolving demands. And in these cases, we can speak of, for instance, a generic interstellar law, as highlighted by Professor García San José, a more concrete interstellar criminal law, as proposed by Professor Bolander, or even we can try to develop an interstellar ius ad bellum and ius in bello in view of a possible future hostile contact with ETI, such as the one we have discussed in this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Professor Hilding to present, Professor Hilding Nielsen is an astrophysicist and professor in the Department of Physics and Physical Oceanography at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, where his research focuses on stellar and exoplanet physics and the stories we can learn from stars and planets. He also works to integrate indigenous knowledges in astrophysics research and how we relate to outer space exploration and the future of large astronomical observatories. He'll be speaking on indigenous methodologies in astronomy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so hopefully you can see my screen. So thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm going to start with a confession. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm very amazed by the work my colleagues have discussed today, but I actually have no idea. What I do work on is astronomy and astrophysics, primarily with an interest in SETI and how we study the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But I also am very interested in how we view things like SETI and astronomy through indigenous knowledges and methodologies. In that respect, I think about indigenous knowledges through the lens of indigenous peoples in North America, but this could also extend to various indigenous methodologies in a global sense. And in that way, we can think about, if we look in North America, or as many people call it, Turtle Island, indigenous peoples have lived on those lands since time immemorial. And living in North America since time immemorial for tens of thousands of years means building a sincere and detailed relationship with the lands that we live on. Furthermore, that relationship extends into the night sky and to the stars, and also into SETI. Many indigenous cosmologies are SETI-based, or can be argued to be SETI-based, whether it is the cosmology of sky women coming from space to help populate the Earth, or the fact that many peoples refer themselves as star people, as coming from space. But having that connection means building a detailed relationship, an intimate relationship with what we observe and how we operate in this system. For many indigenous peoples, we can explore the land through astronomy, because where we are on the land, and any lands, depends on where we are. And so our view of the sky will change whether I'm in Newfoundland, which is in the North Atlantic, or whether I'm in Singapore, or whether I'm in the Arctic or Antarctic. And you can think about it in that respect, just in the extreme cases, our stories of the sky and the universe will change if we're in Australia and the Arctic. Even the moon is a very different perspective. If you're in the northern hemisphere, you see different phases of the moon than if you were in the southern hemisphere, which is, being in the northern hemisphere my entire life, most people don't even realize that reality or that change. This means that if you were to build stories and knowledges about cosmology, astronomy, life in the universe, it would depend on your observations. And I think Professor Bolander kind of outlined some of that in his talk, when you're seeing sites around science fiction, around different stories that are being told about space and aliens, that they influence our view of SETI. But for the purpose of this talk, I want to sort of break away from a traditional Western science and think about it through indigenous knowledges. This is an equitable and equal way of looking at the universe that can come in different ways, but really impacts our view of things like SETI and astronomy. So Daniel Laipe, a scholar, kind of wrote a whole number of these kind of concepts that operate differently in indigenous worldviews. Such as, when we talk about stories, what is above is reflected below. The night sky is a reflection of the land. Or perhaps we could say is that another way of saying that is our view of space and SETI is a reflection of our own biases and our own beliefs. For many peoples, knowledge is relational. It means we're learning as a verb, it is an action. And perhaps this relates back to Professor Bolander's note about having the idea of being technologically advanced and surviving as a sign of wisdom. It's not about whether we're advanced, it's about what we do with it. Knowledge is holistic. This is very much an interdisciplinary discussion, which in its way is holistic in its own way. Whereas my day-to-day is I work in a physics department across the street from a chemistry department, a block away from an English department. We don't really speak very often. But I think most importantly, for many indigenous peoples, is how we think about nature. One of the things that have struck me in listening to the talks is how we talk about humans as something different, or bringing back to the humans versus dolphins case, where we're having this kind of contrast in species, which in many respects in the Western paradigm, humans are above animals or above plants and water. But for many indigenous peoples, nature is familial. It's kin, not brother and sister kin, but kin as in a relation. And that means responsibilities and connections and equity. Dolphins are equal to humans, maybe not in the same way we talk about intelligence, but they have equal rights. Even if we do hunt animals or farm vegetables, they still have rights, and we're part of the system. The reason why I like to do this is because it is my opinion that by embracing indigenous knowledges, we become better scientists, we become better legal scholars, and we have a better framework for understanding the universe, SETI, and so on. And this comes from the Mi'kmaq, First Nation in northeastern United States and Canada, Mi'kmaq communities, under the concept of two-eyed seeing. The idea that you have one lens looking at indigenous knowledges and methodologies, and one lens looking through Western science. And by bringing them together, you get a deeper, richer view of nature around us, whether that is on Earth or in space. And we can bring them together in terms of difference between Western and traditional Western, differences with traditional Western science. So on the left, I show the indigenous axioms again, and noting there is no pan-indigenous knowledge system. There are Mi'kmaq knowledge systems, Inuit knowledge systems. Every nation and peoples have its own perspectives and beliefs. But a lot of the way we think about Western science is the hierarchy of nature. Humans are the apex. Humans are the most important concept. And historically, that definition of human has changed. As we can discuss in terms of indigenous peoples, peoples of color, and so on. And furthermore, the idea of knowledge as objective is problematic because that defines knowledge through technology, whether technology that is something that we can hammer and use, apply, whether it is computers, rockets, and so on. And while those are very important, they're not the be-all, end-all of what is knowledge. So, given that introduction, what does that mean for such things like SETI and possible contact with SETI? And I think that's a very challenging question. My colleagues have postulated very interesting ideas of different types of contact and what it means in terms of militarization and that. But, just the idea of contact is a very big deal because the universe is a big place. And I have gratitude to my colleagues for discussing the Drake equation earlier, because this is one of the important questions in astronomy about how we kind of think about SETI. And so Frank Drake was a radio astronomer in the 1950s who realized that we're leaking radio transmissions in the space. So if we're doing that, maybe we can find it from other sources. And he wrote the mathematical equation you can see behind him in the image, which looks intimidating, but is really analogous to having a jar of jelly beans and trying to count how many of them are green. The idea, each term is about kind of removing some set of the jelly beans until all you're left with are the green ones, or the number of civilizations. And there's a lot in here, whether it is the number of planets, how life is supported, what is life. But most importantly, I think for this discussion is the concepts of intelligent life and civilization. The reason I think these are important is because they impact dramatically our view of what SETI is and what contact could mean. And so what does it mean to be intelligent? Are humans the only intelligent species on Earth? For many people, the answer probably would be an obvious yes. But that depends on how you define intelligence. I think we see things like primates showing intelligence, crows and ravens showing intelligence. In my opinion, cats are probably the most intelligent species. They sit around doing nothing all day. They scratch us when they don't want to talk to us. We feed them and we clean up after them. And all they have to do is show up once in a while. That seems pretty intelligent to me. But there are so many different ways of thinking about this intelligence. Furthermore, civilizations is another way of thinking of intelligence. So how do we define them in a greater system? So from the SETI search, intelligent life and civilization is drawn solely on a Western technological system. And Western, I mean in a classical scientific sense, whether it is, urban cities, bright lights, giant telescopes, rockets. This is the idea of intelligent life. Our definition is also our definition of civilizations. civilization is this human techno civilization. And when we shift back to an indigenous perspective, these things change. And that change is important because that will impact our ability to even recognize SETI if we ever detect it, much less have contact. So when we think about intelligent life, this image in the background is the biological tree of life, tracing back to the last common ancestor between humans, mammals, prokaryotes, fungi, and eukaryotes, and so on, all the way back to the primordial soup of the earth. In showing that in the end, everything that is quote unquote living on Earth, we're related to indirectly far enough back. And they all carry different intelligence. It is worth noting there are single cellular life on Earth that has not changed its evolutionary state in millions of years. It has reached, for its perspective, it has reached its optimal state. How can we say that is not intelligent? We may not be able to communicate with it. We may not be able to understand it or understand its purpose, but that does not deny its intelligence. And when we think about then how long civilizations last. When Frank Drake wrote his equation, one of the key terms was how long do civilizations last? And that could come in different ways, whether they last because they self-destruct, given that Drake wrote this in the height of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons were the biggest fear. Today, many scientists think of climate change as the determining limit, or it could be something else, self-destruction, or it could just be our technology evolves to the point where humans can't detect it. If more recently, radio transmissions in the space that Frank Drake was thinking about have decayed. We don't use that kind of methodology anymore, or as much. Today, we replace it with cell towers, so we have a different radio signal. And so the idea of civilization lasting is a very problematic term. According to Drake, would be about a century. But indigenous civilizations have lived in North America and other parts of the world for millennia. So do they count as civilizations, and should we count them as techno-civilizations in a different way? And so that could mean, from an indigenous view, civilizations could last a lot longer in a lot of different ways. So I'm jumping very quickly through these slides, but the reason I want to talk about this is because it's not clear how all this impacts things like the Drake equation. If you're thinking from an indigenous methodology view, there probably is a lot more different places to find life in our galaxy than what Frank Drake would have thought. Typically in science, when we do the Drake equation, with the best statistics, the best knowledge we have, we might think of 10 or 100 civilizations in a galaxy of 100 billion stars. That's very rare, which is kind of opposite of what you would expect from the Fermi paradox. But if you think about life and civilizations through an indigenous methodology, you would predict that life is far more common. And intelligent life is far more common. And that changes what it means when we think about contact and SETI. That means our detections also change. So this cartoon is sort of asking, what does it mean to detect civilizations? Frank Drake used radio transmissions for SETI. Today, we're thinking about light pollution, that if you have advanced civilization, they just light up the sky. Or Dyson spheres, which are artificial constructs that build shells of a world shell around a star, blocking it off. Or we might look for cell signal, or we might look for, if we're really careful, evidence of nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, which we have on Earth, or climate change. These are all techno signatures. And techno signatures are really defined by not being biological signatures. Like oxygen on Earth is a biosignature, or carbon dioxide is a biosignature. And so we're not actually looking for a technologically advanced civilization. We're looking for a civilization that has created technological impacts, civilizations that have changed their world from its earlier natural form in such a way that it stands out against the biology. And so if in this cartoon, if we think about civilizations having both advancement and impact, and we draw a line that's our Western civilization like, well, we can find impacts that are very high up, that are very beyond us, but are somewhere in high impact, anywhere in technological advancement. In principle, if a society somehow managed to catch fire to every plant on its world, that could actually create a signature that we could detect. And it would potentially be a techno signature. But that's kind of important because that tells us a lot about what we're looking for. And in fact, what it tells us is we're looking for something that is ourselves. I think I missed a little bit of a text there, but if we turn this around, if we put Earth in some point in the middle here on that line, and we contact a civilization that's highly advanced but low impact, what would that mean? Or if we contact a civilization that's highly advanced but high impact, what would it mean? And I think that impacts what it means we have to do in terms of species being benevolent or species being evil towards us, or species we consider intelligent or non-intelligent. To be honest, the most likely contact we all have is if there's life on Europa, a moon of Jupiter. The likelihood of contact with a species from another world, in another solar system, is highly unlikely, and direct contact even more so. So if we have this situation here where we have contact with a low technological impact society, would we recognize that as an equitable species under the law? Would we recognize it as quote unquote human? And the reason I bring this up is because history says no. A lot of the ways we could talk about this is we could look through the lens of colonialism in North America, South America, and so on. Europeans came to North America starting in the 1600s. And when they came, they found people that they didn't recognize. Those people dressed differently. Those people acted differently, spoke differently. They did not have big ships, ports, muskets. They had different ways of living. And those first Europeans struggled to survive here. Samuel de Champlain, a French explorer, came to Quebec and was to Canada around that time and spent the winter. Many of his crew on the ships died from exposure and illness. And wasn't until the local peoples, Haudenosaunee, gave them medicine and a soup that those people recovered. Even in de Champlain's writings, he claimed that this was an act of God, not an act of those people or beings. This is because the Haudenosaunee had a cure for scurvy, which is a disease or condition which a person does not get vitamin C, and that eventually will pass away. And so the Haudenosaunee created a soup from tree bark that contained plenty of vitamin C. And we can carry this forward because things like the historical doctrine of discovery, in which Europeans and the Catholic Church denied that indigenous peoples were human under the grounds they weren't Christian, therefore they had no rights to land and no rights to being, could be removed and suffer acts of genocide. As you can see in this painting, American Progress by John Gast. And so we should be thinking about what it means also to talk about SETI in terms of these contexts, our own history. And that history is sort of what enabled, or I think motivated, Professor Stephen Hawking's comment about messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. But that's very much the view of the colonizer, not the colonizee. And there may be ways of living in peaceful contact. At the early times, and the Dutch broke this treaty, as well as many other peoples, the Haudenosaunee met the Dutch in New York, And they had a treaty based on three principles: friendship, peace, and time. And this treaty was represented in this belt called the wampum, the two-row wampum. This belt, the two rows represent the two peoples, the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee, traveling on the water in their boats in parallel but distinct directions. They can live on their own. And the idea being is that they would have their rights, their culture, their ways. They would not interfere with each other. They would respect each other. And I think that's also a premise for international law in SETI. This is because, in my opinion, the most likely result of any contact would be they would avoid us, because space is big. To send a ship from one star to another would require a tremendous effort or very high technology, very great technology. And so for many species, for that effort, to undergo that effort would not be worth it for them, because it could be generational ships, or it could be planetary scale resources applied to do so. If you're coming here for resources or for something else, there's not much point, because you can get those resources from anything else. So therefore, I would suspect if another species, so-called intelligent, by Western standards or any other standard, knows we're here, they probably wouldn't bother with us. It's just not worth the effort. And therefore, if they do come here, we would operate under a context of peace, maybe friendship, but also parallel development. Something probably, from a science fiction perspective, is closer to the District 9 ideal than the reality of the movie. In doing so, to have this kind of peace, we would require humans primarily to operate in integrity. Historically, we have not done that through whether it's colonization. Even in the space race, we lack some of this. The Artemis Accords seem to deviate from the Outer Space Treaty in many ways, so there are changes there as well, but also with respect to the land. And I use land with a capital L because land is part of who we are, and that includes the night sky and space. So when we do go into space, we have to live in integrity with space, the moon, and celestial bodies. And so when we do interact with SETI, we're interacting with SETI not as for people who are claiming to own something, but as people who live in integrity with that land in space and so on. So in my conclusions, I think it's important to think about how the view of SETI can change through different perspectives. And Indigenous knowledge is one way to enrich the perspectives of academia, astronomy, astrophysics, and perhaps international law. How we think currently about SETI and Drake is largely wedded to a Western traditional knowledge. And this influences how we will behave going forward, largely, and I think the primary example being, again, Dr. Hawking's message about, or idea about not messing with extraterrestrial intelligence out of fear of colonialism. I think it changes how we view advanced civilizations and life. I think it changes this concept of a linear straight line from what humans were and will be relative to aliens, and that we will catch up to them or not. And I think it can influence how we should contact. Professor Bolander discussed issues around UAPs, and there are a number of stories of indigenous peoples having contacts with aliens. In the same way, there are stories of alien UFO contacts with Western people in North America and around the world. But many of the stories for indigenous peoples are very different. It's very much about casual, nonviolent, sometimes protecting each other from Western people, white peoples, depending where you are in North America, and so on. And so I think indigenous methodologies can influence that contact, whether direct or indirect. So I thank you for your attention, and I thank my colleagues for the wonderful talks. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. I think I would like now to, we've got a couple of very good questions. So I think I'll start by reading out the first question we got from Jonathan Lim. Jonathan wants to know, regarding human rights, what influences will international human rights law have in managing our interactions with ETIs?
And I think that probably relates to what I said in my presentation. Maybe I misspoke, or it wasn't quite clear. I don't think my point was not applying human rights to aliens. The question I'm looking at is, because we don't know whether they even will have a concept of rights, a concept of ethics that we would understand. So, and this also goes very quickly into this whole area of meta law, which I'm very skeptical about. But what I meant was, and that's why I made this example about 1,000 human beings being given away as specimens for experiments. How would, if the contact with the ETI was in a manner that contradicted our basic human rights values, and I'm saying basic human rights values because, as we all know, human rights can be restricted between humans already to a certain point, but there are certain core values where you cannot go beyond. And that is my point. If we were asked to do things that would violate these core values, would we want to do it in order to save the world, if that was the offer from that extraterrestrial civilization? So when I talk about human rights, willing to sacrifice, not that we apply human rights to aliens. And aliens might actually be terribly offended if we said we apply our human rights to you. They might see that as an insult, because they might see our human rights system as not terribly advanced. Thank you.
So I hope that answered your question, Jonathan. So what I'll do is I will pick a couple of questions that seem to be directed at certain speakers, so that we have an opportunity to hear from all speakers. So the next question, I think, picks up on Rosa's presentation, is by Tom Royer. So as Tom says, he's a PhD researcher on outer space sustainability law, and he's very intrigued by the role of private entities in the context of outer space commercialization. Could you elaborate on how current international laws and agreements address the involvement and responsibilities of private companies in space activities, particularly concerning planetary defense strategies against potential threats such as asteroid impacts or space debris? Additionally, how do you foresee these legal frameworks evolving as private sector participation in space exploration and utilization increases? So not really on ETI, but I guess it's a question that's up your alley, Rosa.
Yes, thank you, Tom, for the question. As Professor Chia said, it's not really related to the topic we have discussed here. I think putting it into relation to the topic, we could not be speaking of a real responsibility of private companies if we were under an attack by an extraterrestrial intelligence. I somehow see the point of, for instance, what if we launch a space object into outer space to counteract an extraterrestrial intelligence offense, and this creates a space debris. Should a private entity, or should the registry estate be accounted liable for this space debris damage that is caused to the atmosphere? However, I do think that if we were under such a circumstance, we would just be setting apart differences between states and private companies, although every kind of help would be appreciated, especially with regards to technological advancements to deploy this kind of weapons. But I do not think that we should be that picky with interpreting international space law when it comes to international liability for potential damages that may occur in the outer space environment if we were to depart this kind of counteracting measures.
Thank you very much, Rosa. I have now another question from Tom, but this is for Professor Nielsen. Considering the profound impact of light pollution and mega constellations on our understanding of the universe, it raises questions about incorporation of indigenous methodologies in crafting laws for potential extraterrestrial life and post-human space sustainability. How do you envision indigenous knowledge systems contributing to the development of legal frameworks that prioritize dark skies and accommodate potential extraterrestrial beings? Additionally, in the context of post-humanism, how might these indigenous perspectives intersect with emerging ideas of space governance and sustainability?
Oh, thank you for your question. I think some of the things we're working on now through the International Astronomical Union's Center for the Protection of the Dark and Quiet Skies is thinking about how United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples require that Indigenous peoples have a say and a right to access the night sky, whether through dark sky regulation or through also space exploration and satellite development. Primarily being that Indigenous peoples have a right to have a say how space is being used. Currently, things like mega constellations like Starlink are primarily governed by United States law. In principle, international law applies in the sense that the US is liable for any actions that Starlink takes in space that would be illegal. But we have very limited interactions. As it relates to interacting with extraterrestrial beings, I think it changes how we talk about them and interact. As noted, the most likely case of a contact with an extraterrestrial species is going to be something microbial, something single cellular, probably from a moon like Europa. And so that interaction is going to be very problematic because for the most part in the West, we would turn that into a sample to study, not as in something to respect or have something to acknowledge its own sovereignty. And so I think we would want to bring Indigenous knowledge to think about the ethics of that interaction. In the case of what we would call an intelligent or a species capable of harming us directly or intentionally, I think it turns into how we talk with them, how we interact with them, how we talk about human rights or species rights, depending on your perspective. This is important because from a Indigenous perspective, species have inherent rights defined by themselves, and we respect them, not that we define something like human rights and then choose whether or not to respect those rights, which historically on Earth, we have not done a very good job of respecting human rights in different cases, whether it is the rights of people who are trans in the United States, rights of peoples in other parts of the world, and so on. So I think having Indigenous methodologies will allow for a deeper conversation about that, and hopefully will allow for a more peaceful interaction. Thank you.
So I have another question from Jonathan. How would states qualify based on Article 2.4 on self-defense under the UN Charter in the event of use of force premised on a misunderstanding in the absence of mens rea, and that the concept of attack may differ significantly from that held by an ETI? So I guess this would be directed to Professor Bolander as well as Ms. Rosa.
Rosa, do you want to go first?
Sure. So thank you, Jonathan, for your question. I agree with what you stated, that maybe an AT attack could kind of differ to the concept that we have of an armed attack under international law. But I think that when addressing these kind of topics on the international law and the applicability of it to a potential hostile contact with AT, we shall depart from our understanding of armed attack. Otherwise, we could get a little dispersed about it. And of course, it could take form of biological attack or any other sort of attack never seen before. But again, I think we should stay to our own kind of understanding of armed attack in the drafting of potential regulations, because since we haven't had a contact yet, we cannot foresee these possibilities.
Yes, thanks. I would agree with what Rosa says. Uh, Talking about these concepts that we have, again, need to emphasize from a purely human perspective, and trying to transpose them to a contact with an alien species is not going to be of much use, I think, because we need to always to think that the concepts that we have about what constitutes unlawfulness in general terms may not be the concepts that they have. They may not even have a concept of unlawfulness. They just do whatever is useful to them. And if the other side cannot put up a resistance, well, then that's just it. Using the United Nations Charter and Outer Space Treaty and human concepts directly without having this consideration that there needs to be some form of transposal of the essence rather than the writing or the wording of it. If we do that, we're bound to fail. And as Rosea says, there may be the very means of contact may be already something which turns out to be an attack, as Professor Nielsen has said. If you look at colonial history, how many native peoples have been killed by bacteria and viruses brought along by the colonizers, with which they never had any contact before? And we can expect, even if we just find microbes on another planet or another moon like Europa, that they might be interacting with humans in a way that is nefarious. But microbes on Europa don't actually attack us, I think, but it's just a negative consequence. But an alien intelligent species might use such biological means.
If I can interject,
Yes, please.
I think it's worth noting one thing. In SETI, we are pointing our telescopes, radio and optical, at stars that host planets and may have life. In some respects, and colleagues in the US have noted this in the American Indian Journal, that this is a form of surveillance, which, and under many laws in many countries, this kind of surveillance would actually be considered illegal. And so we should be asking, not only do we have to worry about whether or not we're acting on self-defense, but are we already committing violence in some respects to alien species if they exist, if they're there and we're watching them and without even knowing it?
Thanks very much. I'd like to move on to another interesting question by Tom. Considering the current trendiness of Dune with the recent movie release, I'm curious about your take on Frank Herbert's work. Could you share your insights on how Dune resonates with contemporary discussions on outer space exploration and sustainability? Additionally, if I already has touched upon it, I'd love to hear more about your reading of Dune and its relevance to our understanding of space-related challenges and opportunities. Shifting gears a bit, I'm fascinated also by your thoughts on contact and its portrayal of mathematics as a universal language. How does this portrayal in contact influence our perceptions of communication with potential extraterrestrial civilization? Anyone wants to go first? I actually have not watched Dune yet.
Okay, I shall just jump in because I'm a science fiction nerd.
Yes, I really enjoyed that part of your book.
Thanks very much. I've watched the old Dune movie. I've read the first volume of the novel, and I've watched the first part of the current movie. The problem with that it is humans in outer space. It's a far future civilization. They look a little bit different, but they're all humans. So even the names of these different planetary castes are human. They have an emperor. They have names which sound Greek or Spanish. Atreides, that sounds very Greek to me. So it's just a space opera which is set in the far future in a different part of the galaxy, a bit like Star Wars. And it comes with a human DNA for storytelling. So there's nothing. I personally, although I use science fiction in my book as an example of, as Professor Nielsen said, how we approach what our narrative imagination would be to approach this. I find it very difficult to use something like Dune for to think about how SETI would play out, or what we could actually learn from it for SETI, because it's just humans in different shapes and forms interacting with humans. And what's the other one? Contact. The book by Carl Sagan, who formed this phrase about extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you read the book, it's actually quite different from the film. And there's a very, very strange ending, which I'm not going to report here, because somebody might actually start reading a book now. But it's different from the actual movie. And the thing about mathematics, again, that is something on which I would defer to Professor Nielsen. But in my book, I noted that there is something called ethnomathematics, and that there is some evidence that mathematics isn't even seen in the same way among peoples on Earth. So it stands to reason that they might not have the same kind of mathematics. They might have. They might not have. They might recognize that when we send our signals out on the hydrogen line 1420, I think it's megahertz, that they see that as our realization that hydrogen is an element which is present in all the universe. They might not. So it sounds intriguing. It sounds convincing that mathematics would be the first port of call for conversation. But as linguistic issues, it's the same kind of problem is there. Would we understand the way they express their mathematical principles, even if the mathematical principles were the same as we have them? So I'm very skeptical about that. The communication issue is the one big elephant in the room with anything to do with SETI. We might get a signal from somewhere 50,000 light years away that tells us that there is an intelligent or some sort of artificial source there, but it doesn't tell us who they are. It just tells us that they are there or were there at the time when the signal was sent.
Yeah, I think that is. Thank you. I think that's a very interesting take. For Dune is a very interesting movie. In many respects, it is a space opera. In other respects, it is about a colonization as well. It does relate to how a powerful people come to a land and displace the indigenous peoples for the sake, or enslave indigenous peoples for the sake of a resource. In this case, the resource is such that is a drug, a spice that allows you to guide ships through interstellar space. I think the other part that's interesting about Dune is his rejection of technology. Duncan Idaho, which personally I think is the greatest name in Dune, uses a sword because guns are useless, because everybody has shields. They don't use AI, they use people to guide ships. So the technology view is also very different. So I think there are very interesting lessons about SETI in that respect, because what if there is advanced species that reject certain technologies? We know that von Neumann had postulated that if you wanted to colonize our galaxy, you could do so in like 10 million years by sending self-replicating AIs to a planet that can construct the next AI and go to the next planet. So if maybe this is also a nice way of thinking about how we can reject that technology in terms of that colonization, and maybe part of the Fermi paradox. But in the end, I kind of think Dune is a little bit space opera, and given that I know Herbert's son wrote about 6 million books on Dune, it's also a very heavily worn out space opera. Contact, I haven't read the book. I think the movie is very interesting because it also really notes that SETI is easy. We can point a telescope and wait, but actual contact is hard. And, we had to go through imaginary physics to have the point of contact in the movie. And I pick up on the point about mathematics as a universal language as being problematic. I don't know how many of you remember the year 2012 when a lot of people panicked that it was going to be the end of the world based on the Mayan calendar in Mexico. And this is because the Mayans not only did math differently, they used a base 20 system instead of base 10. And they counted their years very differently. So they had two systems for counting years. One is a 260-day calendar, one's a 365-day calendar. And the interplay of those create these really long cycles of tens of thousands of years that act like decades, millennia in a Western system. And so 2012 for a Mayan person is just turning over a calendar. Whereas for many people in, well, I'll say US and Canada, it turned into this great science fiction about the end of the world and turned into this really horrible schlocky movie that you should watch, because that is the worst sci-fi probably ever. And so I think the idea of using math for communications is plausible, but I don't think we would understand their math. I think the hydrogen, talking about the 21 centimeter line of hydrogen, which is a rotational feature hydrogen that is pervasive in our galaxy, probably is a good way of communicating, because at least it's something we know they can observe. The question is whether our symbology of that line in hydrogen is actually understandable. Because, you know, even I use a different metric than what Professor Bolander used to define it. He used a frequency, I used a wavelength. And, you know, if you don't know the speed of light is a constant, or if you pick different units, we would have very different numbers. And so there's so many different problems with how we do interstellar communication that we have no idea. I mean, what we put down is really just a fun guess, but it also comes with our own biases. The Pioneer plaque is the biggest bias. It has a whole bunch of math. It has images of humans, a man and a woman, coded white man, white woman. Problematic in terms of their display because they're both nude, but one has genitalia, the other doesn't, and so on. So we kind of code things very differently. So if an alien were to find that, they would have and think those images were actual people, they would have a very weird understanding of what humanity looks like in general, or idea of the fact of binary sexes on Earth. They would have a weird idea because of that, of the issue of how it was drawn. So I think there's lots of issues with communication that we will probably never really solve or it's one of those things we will solve after the fact. We have communication because we have no sense of framework to actually think of two separate and completely independent communication systems. And so we can't do anything until that happens.
Rosa, would you like to add anything? This will be our last question.
Yes, I could briefly add up to what the other panelists have said. From a SETI perspective, I agree totally with what Professor Bolander has stated. And adding up on what Professor Nielsen said, I think we can also regard the movie of Dune from a space sustainability perspective in the sense of space resources. So international space law in Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says that there should not be a national appropriation of celestial bodies and aerospace in general. So what we can attest in the Dune movie is what has already been said, indigenous communities being deprived of this space resource, which could be the especia, the espèce, and we should resort here to the long discussion in the space law literature regarding whether using this space resource could be a sort of appropriation or not. I think the way that it is depicted in the Dune movie actually shows an appropriation, a forceful appropriation of it. So regarding it from a space law perspective, it could be completely unlawful. And of course, we could here have a lot of arguments regarding space sustainability and so on.
Well, I'm conscious of time. Thank you so much to our participants for their great questions. And thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you, Professor Bolander, Professor Nielsen, and Ms. Almanar. I've really learned a lot. I'm sure our participants have also learned a lot. So with that, I will draw this to a close. And the video of this seminar will also be made online at our CAL's YouTube channel. And so anyone who has missed this seminar can also watch your presentations there. So thank you very much once again. I'm very aware of the time difference and I really appreciate you making the effort. And thank you also, Momaka, for staying outside your office hours to help us with this.